The morning my brother handed me those papers, the sky looked harmless. That kind of bright, soft blue that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen under it. I remember thinking how peaceful the estate felt that day, the family's ancestral mansion standing proud at the edge of the valley, the air still smelling faintly of old wood and spring blossoms. It was my first visit back home since my father's funeral 3 months earlier, and though every hallway held ghosts, I'd come to tie up loose ends, not open old wounds. My brother Ethan greeted me at the door with his signature half-hug, half-performance. The same one he'd used since we were kids when he wanted something. "Lila, you look good," he said, flashing that smile that could melt granite. His wife, Naomi, trailed behind him, the picture of quiet complicity. She didn't meet my eyes, just murmured something polite and disappeared toward the kitchen. The house hadn't changed, the oil portraits of long-dead relatives, the scent of lemon polish, the faint echo in the marble hall. Only one thing was missing, the warmth that had once lived here when my father was alive. He'd been the kind of man who treated integrity like oxygen. Ethan inherited his charm. I inherited his conscience. And somewhere between those two traits, a storm had been brewing for years. "Let's go over the papers before lunch," Ethan said, guiding me toward Father's study. That room had always been his sanctuary, books lined floor to ceiling, the heavy mahogany desk scarred from decades of honest work. My father built his business from nothing, turned our estate into a legacy, and left it, in his will, equally divided between Ethan and me. That was the last clear thing before grief blurred everything else. I sat across from Ethan, watching as he slid a thin folder across the desk. "Just some paperwork for the trustees," he said, voice light, casual, practiced. "Legal housekeeping. The lawyers wanted our signatures so the property transfer runs smoothly." I nodded, too trusting, too eager to keep the peace. We'd fought enough after the funeral. I wanted to believe we were finally on the same side. The papers looked legitimate, dense legal text, seals, signatures from attorneys I vaguely recognized from the firm that handled Father's estate. My name was there. So was Ethan's. He'd even highlighted the spots where I needed to sign, neat yellow lines guiding my pen. He poured me coffee like a perfect host, the porcelain cup placed just so beside the contract. As I signed each page, I felt a strange unease, like standing at the edge of a cliff you can't see but know is there. Ethan was talking about property taxes, maintenance costs, renovations. His voice was steady, confident, rehearsed. I should have heard the cracks in it, but grief makes you deaf to deceit. I signed the last page and handed him the pen. "Perfect," he said, too quickly. He gathered the papers with a little too much relief, slipping them back into the folder. "You'll thank me later," he added, almost under his breath. At lunch, Naomi avoided my eyes again. Her hands trembled when she poured water into my glass. "You okay?" I asked gently. She nodded, the kind of nod people give when the truth would choke them. "Fine," she whispered. Ethan kept the conversation light. Plans for the estate, ideas for expanding the vineyard, talk about legacy and vision, words that meant everything to him and nothing to me in that moment. When I left that afternoon, the air felt different. I remember looking back at the house, the windows glinting like watchful eyes. Something in my gut whispered that I'd just walked out of my inheritance and didn't even know it. But I pushed the thought away. Ethan was my brother. Family doesn't deceive family. 3 weeks later, I learned otherwise. It started with a letter from the law firm, a short, formal notice that the transfer of full property ownership had been completed in accordance with my signed consent. Confused, I read it twice. Full ownership. That couldn't be right. I called the firm immediately, heart pounding. "Yes, Miss Cole," the lawyer said, his tone polite but distant. "As per the document signed on March 14th, you relinquished all rights to the estate and related assets to Mr. Ethan Cole." Relinquished, the word hit like a physical blow. "No, there must be a mistake," I said. "That wasn't what I signed." There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough for reality to slip in. "Miss Cole," he said carefully, "I reviewed the paperwork myself. The documents are legally binding. You signed them in front of a witness, Naomi Cole." The room tilted. I couldn't breathe. My own sister-in-law had witnessed the theft. That night, I drove back to the estate. Rain pounded the windshield, blurring the road, but I could barely see. through my own fury anyway. When I arrived, Ethan was in the living room, a glass of scotch in his hand, the fire painting smug gold on his face. "Leela," he said with mock surprise. "You should have called. What did you make me sign?" My voice shook, but it carried enough steel to silence the room. "Relax," he said, setting his glass down. "It's just business. You didn't want the responsibility. You said yourself you hated managing assets. I'm just keeping things simple." "You stole my inheritance," I whispered. He leaned back in Father's chair, the one that was supposed to be shared. "No," he said slowly. "You gave it away. I just helped with the paperwork." Naomi stood at the staircase, silent, pale, gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For a second, I saw guilt flicker across her face, then disappear under fear. I walked toward the desk, staring at the empty spot where Father's nameplate used to be. "He would be ashamed of you," I said softly. Ethan smirked. "He'd be proud. Someone had to take control. You never had the stomach for real business." That was the moment something inside me broke, not in weakness, but in awakening. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just looked at him and said one thing. "You'll regret underestimating me." And I left. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the gate, but thunder still rolled in the distance. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I wasn't beaten. I'd lost an estate on paper, but I still had something Ethan would never understand. I had patience. I had time. And most importantly, I had the truth. He'd taken my inheritance with ink and deception. I was going to take back everything with precision and proof. And when I did, I wasn't just going to win. I was going to own it all. The shock didn't last long. Shock is useful for a day or two, long enough to adjust your jaw and stop the small animal noise that wants to escape your throat. After that, it turns into a kind of hot, useful clarity. I woke up the next morning with a list in my head instead of questions. First item, understand exactly what Ethan had done. Second item, find proof. Third item, make it impossible for him to enjoy it. I started where any reasonable person would start the paper trail. Father had always been obsessive about records. Ledgers, receipts, handwritten notes, decades of letters in a battered stationery box in the attic. I pulled everything down and spread it across my dining table like a map. There were old deeds, loan paperwork, the original will I'd seen years ago when Father joked about funeral reading drama. The will had been clear, equal division of the estate. That ought to have been enough. But law is a machine that runs on signatures and forms, not on truth. Ethan had weaponized the forms. I called a probate attorney that afternoon. His name was Hernandez, gray at the temples, steady-voiced, and annoyingly correct. He listened, asked a few specific questions, and then said the thing that felt at once terrifying and promising. "If what you signed doesn't reflect your intent, you can contest it. But you need evidence. Handwriting, analysis, witness testimony, time-stamped records. Fraud cases live and die on detail." He didn't say revenge, but I heard it in the space between his sentences. Next, I hired Dr. Elena Park, a forensic document examiner recommended by the attorney. She arrived the following week carrying a briefcase of tools that made her look like a traveling scientist or a precision surgeon. Her first questions were methodical. When did I sign? Where was the pen? Who else was present? I handed her the copies Ethan had filed and the originals I still possessed. She went quiet in a way that felt like good news. "You were right to keep those cards," she said. "Because signatures are patterns. They change under stress and age. We can compare pressure, stroke, tilt. If someone forged it, the paper will tell us exactly how." While Elena worked her microscope magic, I became everyone I could to gather corroboration. I talked to the gardener who'd trimmed the hedges the morning Ethan presented the papers. He remembered Naomi carrying a stack of folders into the study. I found the housekeeper who cleaned for my father. She remembered that day because Father had asked her to bring tea, and Naomi had fussed about the teapot being chipped. Small details. Tiny constant threads. They mattered. The title search at the county recorder's office was the next revelation. Ethan hadn't simply filed an internal transfer. He'd recorded a quitclaim deed and a new grant of ownership in the public records. Legally, it looked clean on the surface. Underneath, though, I found an odd timestamp and a suspiciously fast notarization. The notary listed was a local woman who remembered Ethan dropping by while she was closing for lunch. He was in a hurry, she told me. He said it was just paperwork to finish the estate. That "in a hurry" turned into a lead. I subpoenaed the CCTV footage from the street cameras near the notary's office. The footage showed Ethan arriving with a man I later discovered worked at a local title company. They walked in together. 3 minutes and 5 frames later both walked out. The footage also showed Naomi waiting in her car outside in a way that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. I felt the weight of the network Ethan had built: friendly lawyers, a complacent notary, a title company willing to move fast for the right assurances. Greed lubricates bureaucracy. Elena's report came back with clarity that felt like vindication. The signature on the deed had the wrong pressure points. The loops in certain letters were inconsistent with my grandmother's last years. There was a tremor in the forged strokes that matched none of the signatures in my drawer of family cards. Most damning, microscopic ink distribution showed the document originally bore a different signature that had been chemically altered. Someone had tried to bleach the old ink and write a new name over it. It was crude and brilliant in the same breath. Armed with that, Hernandez and I mapped a legal offensive. We filed an emergency motion to freeze any transfers and place a lis pendens on the property. It's a clumsy phrase for a sharp legal trap: put a cloud on the title so no one can sell or mortgage the estate until the court untangles the knot. It required urgency and precision. The filing clerk's eyebrows rose when Hernandez slid the paperwork across. "You have strong grounds," she murmured, and her surprise gave me strength. Ethan noticed the first freeze not because I told him but because the county recorder called him. He texted me that afternoon, asked to meet, and when I saw him at the front gate his face had that practiced complacency on it, like cardboard trying to be a person. "We need to talk," he said. "This is tearing the family apart." His voice sounded theatrical. It fed me. I invited him into the study but kept the blinds closed and the laptop open to a tab showing Elena's preliminary findings. "You did this," I said quietly. I didn't accuse as much as state fact. People hate certainty because it takes the script away. Ethan's mouth tightened. "You signed," he replied. "You signed willingly." It was a tired defense. "3 witnesses saw you leave the notary's office with a man from the title company," I said, watching for the flinch. "The CCTV shows you coordinating with Naomi. Elena found chemical alteration on the signature. The notary confirms you were in a hurry. These are not coincidences." I watched his gaze flicker to the laptop, then to my hands folded on the desk. What I did next was surgical and slow. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I called his bluff in a way he couldn't spin. "You could tell the truth," I said. "You could walk into the county and withdraw those filings. You could return what you took. Or you could let the court untangle this. I prefer the truth." I watched as something like panic replaced his practiced smirk. "Good. Panic is honest." He left without another word. That evening my phone buzzed with messages from cousins who'd heard gossip and from a trustee I didn't know I could call. They were tentative at first, friendly, and then suddenly helpful with documents they'd saved or anecdotes I could use. It turned out father had been meticulous with correspondence. People in the community respected him. Once word spread that the estate's division was contested and that the will might be the product of manipulation, people who'd been indifferent to family drama for years started producing letters and notes that helped my case. 2 weeks into the fight, I received a call from a woman I hadn't spoken to since childhood, Aunt Hilda, who ran a small antique shop 3 towns over. She had a box of father's old receipts and, more importantly, a notarized letter father had written 2 summers before his death. In it he reiterated his intent that Ethan and I split the estate equally, spoke with specific complaints about greedy lawyers who promised quick deals, and expressed his desire that neither child use the estate for personal gain. It wasn't a will, but it was a map of intent and character witness material that judges respect. When the temporary injunction came through, Ethan's world narrowed. He had a lawyer now, a flashy one who smelled of new cologne and old money, and they argued vigorously in court. But lawrooms weigh documents, patterns, witness statements. We had Elena's analysis, the CCTV timestamps, notary testimony, Aunt Hilda's letter, and Mr. Peterson's correspondence, a chain that connected the dots in ways Ethan's hastily gathered friends couldn't unlearn. Yet I learned something crucial in the process. Winning the legal battle wouldn't be the end. The estate wasn't merely land and houses. It was reputation, history, community, memory. Ethan had tried to erase my place in that history with ink. To reclaim it, I needed to be meticulous, patient, relentless. I also needed to transform the feeling of violation into something fueled by method, not rage. Rage makes you loud, method makes you unstoppable. When I left the courthouse that day, the sky was the same soft blue as the morning I'd signed. It felt like a promise, rather than a taunt. Ethan had won the first skirmish in ink. I'd won the groundwork for the war that mattered, the legal terrain. The estate hummed with its old life the way a body hums after being hurt and then healed. There would be hearings, challenges, probably months of appeals. I didn't flinch. I had patience, paperwork, and people who remembered the truth. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quieter plan was forming, one that would not only reclaim what was mine but expose every crooked hand that helped Ethan steal it. The next move would be public, precise, and devastating in a way courts rarely can be. For now, though, I let the method breathe. The law would move, and I would be ready when it did. The court hearing was held on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day that made even the marble hallways look tired. I stood in the corridor, clutching the folder Hernandez had prepared. Inside were my father's letters, Elena's forensic report, and the evidence that could finally turn the tide. Ethan arrived 5 minutes late, as if arrogance could bend time. He wore a navy suit that probably cost as much as my car, but confidence had left him somewhere between his front door and the courthouse. Naomi followed quietly behind him, her heels echoing down the hallway like reluctant footsteps toward judgment. When the judge called our case, we entered the courtroom together, siblings on paper, strangers in truth. The air was sharp with tension. Ethan's lawyer, the kind of man who'd perfected false sincerity, began with charm. He painted Ethan as a misunderstood son, a devoted brother burdened with the administrative weight of an estate too complex for one person to handle. His voice was smooth, persuasive, professional lies wrapped in legal vocabulary. I didn't look at Ethan while he spoke. Instead, I watched Naomi. She was pale, rigid, her hands twisting her wedding ring until it slipped off and clattered onto the table. A small sound, but in the quiet courtroom, it felt like a confession. When it was our turn, Hernandez stood, calm and deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about confusion. It's about deception, calculated, deliberate, and provable." He walked the judge through every piece of evidence with surgical precision. The handwriting analysis came first. Elena testified, her voice steady as she described ink density, pen pressure, and microscopic chemical residue from an altered signature. Then came the notary's deposition, confirming that Ethan had brought pre-signed documents and rushed the process. The CCTV footage followed, grainy, silent, but damning. Ethan's face, frozen in the act of exchanging envelopes with a man from the title company, played on the courtroom monitor, like a trailer for his downfall. By the time Aunt Hilda took the stand, the judge had already stopped taking notes. Her testimony was simple, heartfelt. She spoke of my father's integrity, of his repeated insistence that both his children inherit equally. She held up his handwritten letter, the one he'd signed in front of her antique shop years ago, reaffirming his intent. "He was clear," she said softly. "He didn't raise one heir. He raised two." Her words landed heavier than any legal argument. When the judge finally called for recess, Ethan avoided my eyes. Naomi didn't. She looked at me with a kind of pleading, the look of someone trapped between guilt and fear. As we stepped into the hallway, she followed me. "Leela," she whispered, voice trembling. I tried to stop him. I really did. He said it was temporary. Just to get the taxes settled. He promised he'd transfer it back after a few months. I studied her face, the streaks of mascara, the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion that comes from lying too long. "And you believed him?" I asked. Her silence was answer enough. "Naomi, you signed as witness." She looked down. "He said you'd already agreed." I didn't know until later. There was a truth in her tone that made me pause. "Why tell me now?" I asked. She swallowed hard. Because he told me yesterday that if we lost, he'd blame it on me. Said I was the one who mishandled the paperwork. She handed me a small flash drive. This is the original copy of his emails to the notary. I saved them. I thought. Maybe one day I'd need them. The hearing resumed after lunch. Hernandez presented the flash drive. The emails were short but lethal timestamps, attachments, messages where Ethan instructed the notary to adjust dates and remove references to dual ownership. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read them. Ethan's lawyer tried to object, but even his voice sounded deflated now. When the judge looked up, her expression had changed from neutral to cold. "Mr. Cole," she said, "this goes far beyond administrative confusion." Ethan shifted in his seat, face pale, hands clenched. "Your Honor, my client misunderstood." "No," the judge interrupted. "Your client manipulated. There is a difference." The verdict didn't take long. The judge ruled in my favor, invalidating the fraudulent transfer and reinstating joint ownership of the estate, pending further review. But she went further. The court referred Ethan's actions to the district attorney for potential charges of fraud and perjury. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and just like that, the house our father built returned to its rightful place to both of us. But in truth, to me, Ethan stood frozen, unable to process the speed of his own collapse. Outside, the reporters were already gathering. Local news had caught wind of the Cole estate scandal. Cameras flashed as Ethan stormed past them, shoving microphones away. Naomi trailed behind him, head bowed, avoiding the storm she'd helped create. Hernandez shielded me as best he could, but one question cut through the noise. "Miss Cole, what will you do now that you've won?" I paused, the answer coming easily. "I'm not done yet." Because victory in court wasn't enough. Ethan had tried to erase me. He'd made me the villain in our family, whispered stories to relatives about how I'd abandoned responsibility, how I was selling pieces of the estate to pay debts that didn't exist. Reputation, in our world, was currency, and he'd stolen that too. So I started rebuilding not just ownership, but legacy. I met with the trustees, the vineyard manager, and the estate staff, people who'd quietly endured months of Ethan's new leadership. I promised them stability, fair pay, and respect. Within a week, half of Ethan's loyal employees resigned to join my side. I didn't gloat. I simply began to rebuild the house in my father's image: transparent books, honest work, quiet dignity. Ethan, meanwhile, doubled down on denial. He called relatives, begged for sympathy, spun stories about being betrayed by his own sister. But the truth had legs now, and it ran faster than his lies. Naomi's testimony sealed his fate publicly, and when the district attorney opened an investigation, the whispers turned into headlines. Local businessman accused of estate fraud. Cole family scandal deepens. Brother allegedly forged sister's signature. Each article stripped away the armor he'd built around himself. The last time I saw him, he was sitting on the courthouse steps after another hearing, his lawyer gone, his tie loosened, his eyes hollow. He looked up when I passed. "You could have just let it go," he said quietly. I stopped. "You could have just not stolen it," I replied. He laughed once, bitterly. "You've changed." "No," I said. "You just finally saw who I am." I walked away and didn't look back. That night, for the first time since my father's death, I unlocked his old study, my study now. The desk was empty except for a single framed photograph I hadn't noticed before. It was the two of us as kids, sitting on the same porch where Ethan had once promised we'd always have each other's backs. The caption on the frame, written in father's handwriting, said simply, "Fairness isn't a gift. It's a choice." I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I placed it back on the shelf, locked the drawer beneath it, and whispered to the empty room, "I made mine." Outside, the vineyard lights glowed like constellations across the hills. The estate, my inheritance, my legacy, was finally whole again. But more than that, I was whole again. Because the battle for what was mine had taught me something Father always knew. Money builds walls, but integrity builds empires that last generations. And while Ethan had tried to steal the house, I had reclaimed the foundation: truth, dignity, and the right to stand unshaken in the home our father built with honest hands. Winning the case didn't feel like triumph, not at first. It felt like silence. A deep, echoing quiet that settled in the hallways of my father's estate. The walls that once carried laughter now carried memory, the kind that hums softly when justice has finally been served. But justice, I was learning, wasn't a finish line. It was a doorway. And I wasn't done walking through it. 2 weeks after the ruling, I stood in the great hall of the Cole estate with a dozen staff members, people who'd stayed loyal through Ethan's arrogance and my absence. They watched me not as a returning heir, but as someone they hoped would restore balance. We're not starting over, I told them. We're starting right. That became our motto. My father's estate wasn't just land. It was a family business, vineyards, a boutique label, small but prestigious. Ethan had treated it like a trophy, hosting expensive galas, while debts grew in the shadows. When I inherited it back, I found the books in disarray, payments overdue, vendors unpaid, machinery neglected. It would have been easier to sell, take the money, and move on. But I couldn't. The vineyard was more than property. It was proof that honest work could outlive betrayal. I hired a new accountant, Maria, a quiet genius with a sharp sense for numbers and nonsense. Within a month, she'd traced the financial rot Ethan had left behind: hidden accounts, inflated expenses, and a silent partnership with one of his friend's companies that overcharged us for supplies. "He wasn't just stealing from you," she said. "He was bleeding the vineyard to feed his ego." So I did what any betrayed daughter with a legal victory and a grudge would do: I turned the tables. I filed a motion to reclaim every cent through restitution, backed by the same evidence that had destroyed his case. When the audit was done, the amount owed to the estate was $1.4 million, and Ethan's name was on every document. His lawyer tried to stall. His bank accounts tried to hide, but the law moves like time, slow until it doesn't. The court approved a lien on his assets, including his half of a small real estate firm he'd co-founded. And that's when the poetic symmetry appeared. The firm's largest creditor, the Cole estate, the same land he'd tried to steal, now owned the debt of the company he'd built to prove he didn't need me. 6 months later, I signed the purchase agreement that made it official. The Cole estate now controlled majority shares in Ethan's company. The nameplate on the door changed quietly one Friday afternoon. He didn't even know until Monday morning when he walked in and saw the new logo on the wall: Cole Holdings, the family name he'd tried to erase. When he called me, I didn't answer. Not the first time. Not the second. On the third attempt, I picked up. "You can't do this," he said, his voice trembling, a mix of disbelief and desperation. "I already did," I replied softly. "You bought my company out from under me." "No," I corrected, "I bought back what you built with stolen money. I'm just returning it to its rightful owner." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You wanted revenge." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "No, Ethan. I wanted balance. Revenge burns out. Balance lasts." That night, the estate's tasting room reopened. Not as a vanity project like when Ethan ran it, but as something real. We named our new label Legacy Red because every drop of it was built from what we survived. The first bottles sold out in a week, helped by the media buzz around the Cole siblings scandal. But this time, the story wasn't about betrayal. It was about rebirth. One journalist asked me what it felt like to own everything my brother tried to take. I thought for a moment before answering. "It feels like standing in a house you rebuilt after a fire," I said. "You remember the flames, but you also remember the hands that helped you rebuild." Ethan disappeared from the headlines soon after. Word spread that he'd left the city, sold his car, and moved into a rented apartment on the outskirts of town. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Because true victory isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the silence that follows when you've turned every wound into wisdom. Still, I couldn't let the story end in bitterness. That's not what my father would have wanted. So one afternoon, I drove to Ethan's apartment. It wasn't pity that brought me there, it was closure. He opened the door looking older, thinner, smaller somehow. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something closer to shame. "Leela," he said, like the name tasted different now. "I'm not here to fight," I told him. "I'm here to settle." I placed a small envelope on his table. Inside was a letter notarized and official offering him a chance to sell me his remaining 10% stake in the estate for a fair price. "You'll be free," I said. "No more courts. No more debt. No more me. He looked at the paper for a long time. Then, quietly, he nodded. I don't deserve it. You don't, I agreed. But I'm giving it anyway. Because I deserve peace. He signed without hesitation. For the first time since our father's death, his hand didn't shake. When I left that apartment, the air smelled like rain, the same scent that had filled the morning of our first court hearing. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was clean. Renewal disguised as weather. Months passed. The vineyard thrived. Legacy Red expanded to 3 new markets. I turned the family estate into more than a winery, into a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs who came from nothing but had ideas worth believing in. We called it the Cole Foundation for Integrity in Business. Every brochure carried our motto, start right. Stay honest. On the first anniversary of the verdict, I hosted a dinner at the vineyard, not the kind Ethan used to throw with chandeliers and ego, but one with long tables under string lights, filled with the people who had stayed, who had believed. The staff, the neighbors, even Aunt Hilda with her antique brooch and proud smile. Maria stood beside me, holding a glass of Legacy Red. You know, she said, this place feels lighter now. Like it's breathing. Again. It is, I said. Because it finally belongs to the right person. Halfway through the evening, I walked down the gravel path toward my father's old bench by the vines. The sun was setting, pouring gold across the hills. I sat there quietly, the glass in my hand catching the last light of day. Dad, I whispered. I did it. I kept your promise alive. A breeze moved through the vines, soft, steady, almost like an answer. For a moment, I imagined my father there beside me, not as a ghost, but as pride in motion, alive in the land, the wine, the work. And when I looked back at the house, my house now, I realized something simple but profound. Ethan had inherited the same blood as me, but not the same lesson. He wanted power. I wanted purpose. Power fades. Purpose endures. That was the inheritance my father had left me, not land, not wealth, but the strength to rebuild everything that was taken. And I did. When the stars came out over the vineyard, I raised my glass and smiled. The house, the name, the legacy, they were all mine again. But more importantly, so was I.